I'm Helen Collis, a senior health journalist at Politico, but it is by no means the least panel of the day. We have a discussion on the topic of whether or not Europe should compensate or pay people for donating their plasma. So it might seem like a niche topic, but with Europe dependent on supplies from the United States to deliver plasma that it needs for plasma-derived medicines, Europe wants to find a more sustainable solution. It's also very pertinent because we have the EU nearing the final stages of completing new legislation that will dictate to what extent donors can receive any money for their plasma. But before we start, some final reminders. You can ask questions through the Swap Card platform by scanning the QR code or by following the instructions on our website. If you hear something you'd like to share online, our hashtag is Politico Healthcare. And before I do introduce the speakers, I do want to stress that Politico makes every effort to have diversity and balance across our panels, including gender, nationality, and political perspectives. We did reach out to female leaders in this sector, but they were either unavailable or declined the offer. So it's just me on the panel as a girl. So joining us today, we have Jakub from the far end, Jakub Dvoracek, the Deputy Health Minister for the Czech Republic. We have Peter O'Leary, Executive Director for the European Blood Alliance, next to me here. Martin van Balen, Executive Director of the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association in Europe, and Stefan van der Spiegel, Team Leader for Substances of Human Origin at DG Santé in the European Commission. So we're currently awaiting the final text of the regulation on the substances of human origin, or SOHO, but we know that there's already been a heated back and forth over one of the topics, which is around compensation for plasma donations. Stefan, I wanted to come to you first. You've been working with the Commission on these proposals for SOHO, and specifically conditions around compensation for plasma. Why is it that this topic of compensation for plasma really seems to divide people?
Well, thanks for your question. Thanks for having us here. It's about finding good balance between how to make sure that donors really are motivated to donate and that they don't encounter disincentives and barriers to do that. On the one hand, and on the other hand, also making sure that donors are not over-incentivized and do not start seeing this and that does not become a source of potential financial income and then with possible consequences for that. So it's that balance that is to be found, and it's in the middle. It's what we call the zone of financial neutrality. And obviously, there's today, as we look at the landscape in the European Union, there's different views on that. I think everybody would agree with that need of voluntary unpaid donation and financial neutrality. It's also in line with the Charter on Human Rights, and so there can be no commercialization of the human body. But the practical implementation, of course, per country is also sometimes different. The healthcare systems in charge of, in all countries still there's collection by public sectors. In some countries there's collection by private actors. So there's a lot to be balanced here, and I think that's really why there's so much need to make sure we have it well tuned in the final text. I think we really did a big effort to do that in the Commission proposal, but of course Council and Parliament will have their views on that also, and we need in the end to make sure that we maintain that balance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Peter, you represent the publicly run blood and plasma groups in Europe. Currently, just 4 countries in the EU allow the private collection of plasma through private firms who normally pay a fixed fee to donors. That can be something around 25 to 35 euros a time. And we've just heard from Stefan they need to find a balance and find this kind of zone of net neutrality. Is there a risk that, is that really enough money to encourage any kind of risky behaviour around donation?
Well, I suppose if you look at compensation in general, you have a situation whereby it encourages high-frequency donation, which is itself risky. We also have examples whereby So whatever the compensation level, we have people travelling for plasma donation, cross borders, examples of that, going towards. Going towards where the compensation is. So it obviously, there is a subset of people who are incentivized by remuneration.
Okay, and in Europe, so you have examples of people going across European borders for donating?
It was reported to the Commission actually in 2016. So there was, and two good examples whereby both Slovakia and Hungary reported people crossing borders to donate plasma in paid centres in Austria. So interestingly, in Slovakia it doesn't have a paid model, but Hungary does, and had shortages itself in immunoglobulin at the time. So those kind of examples. So it's moving for remuneration, which clearly shows an incentive is driving that.
And do you have any insight into what kind of people would be doing that?
Only anecdotal. I think we're all aware of the kind of situations that occur, say, in the United States, etc. And it's anecdotal in terms of who travels.
I guess we're kind of concerned about sort of vulnerable people who might be more incentivized to go to do that than other people. Martin, the industry that you represent develops the medicines from these plasma donations. The PPTA is in favour of allowing compensation that has a broad definition, allowing countries to choose their own approach, be it a fixed rate or not. Why is it so important to the industry to continue to allow a broad definition of compensation?
Well, most countries today provide some form of compensation. So whether it's a tax advantage or a meal voucher, or if it's a fixed rate allowance, or in some countries they provide days off work, for example, it should be possible for member states eventually to choose their preferred way of compensating donors, just like Stefan was saying, but also the way and how they establish an ecosystem to increase plasma collection. So I think member states should have the options there. And therefore it's important to have a broad definition. Also in the definition it is included that member states can set an upper limit, so they can also find that sweet spot that for them, for the country, works. Just want to mention something on people crossing borders. That's not that evident. I mean, donors are being monitored and donors are being assessed. They get a medical checkup when they arrive at the center. So a Polish person that travels, for example, to Germany needs to have a Polish-speaking physician in front of him to ensure that that physician can do a donor assessment. They need to have a Polish questionnaire in place as well. That's something that is not self-evident, so all of that needs to be in place. Also, in order to control that risky behavior, that's why donors are being screened. Their protein levels are being checked, their immunoglobulin levels are being checked, to ensure that they would not be donating too much, for example, or would not be donating if their immunoglobulin levels would be low, for example.
Okay. And I wondered, Stefan, looking at the proposals and the regulation, would there be, are there any sort of incentive to prevent people from crossing borders? Was it something that was discussed when the SOHO regulation was being drawn up?
It is an element, but it's not the core element, I think, in the proposal. I think what we try to do in the proposal is to make sure that in every country there's a reflection on what is considered an appropriate level of compensation in line with those principles of financial neutrality and voluntary and paid donation, and to define it for each of the different types of donations in the SOHO framework. And of course, what we have, and it's inherent across the European Union, is we have countries with different wealth and GDP per capita. So an amount of maybe the 30 euros you mentioned before might be very appropriate in France, but maybe not at all, or in Austria, but might not at all be appropriate and has another dimension if you go to Romania and that's of course that's a very deep inherent situation in society that of course is economically that is way beyond this proposal.
Jakob, the Czech Republic is one of the 4 countries that does allow the private collection of plasma. It has among some of the highest collection rates in Europe. What has the country's own experience been with private plasma collection? And do you have any examples of or concerns about risky behaviour or people crossing borders to donate from your country?
So first, I have to say we are the country with highest plasma production per capita in Europe. And I have to say, if you take the first one, and for example, the third country, if you take the Czech Republic, Austria, Germany, the difference between us and the Germany is even doubled. Yeah, it's like it's close to 80 liters, per 1,000 inhabitants. It's really a lot. We allowed the compensation. I don't think so. It's really make the problem, with the risk behavior. But on the other hand, I also have to say that when I see, the extension of the places which are collecting the plasma, and also the pressure, on the market itself, we also have, some issues, with the current regulation, because we will definitely be happy to see, the more involvement of the other countries to decrease the pressure on those 4 countries which are really producing the majority of the plasma which is needed in Europe. And if I take the example, of other area, for example, the API for pharmaceuticals, we are now deeply discussing, how to bring the production of API back to Europe. And we are dependent now on the countries like China, maybe India, a number of other countries, sometimes, from the regions which are risky. And of course, it's not the case of the United States. But should we stay, in the current status, that this situation where you have only 4 countries really producing, such a big amount of plasma, and the rest of the Europe dependent, on those 4 countries, plus the US and plus other sources. This is something, what we see as risky also for the country, which is now, let's say, keen to produce it, such an amount.
And Stefan, I see you nodding. Did you want to come in on something you were saying there?
No, I think we all recognize the situation. I think it is the aim that more countries across Europe should get more collection. It's just that every country needs to, of course, decide how they want to do that, because in the end, in particular, every country, as said, has a public blood service or has non-profit actors that work for them. So it's also a lot from those actors that need to undertake action. It's partly about donors, but it's also about the organizations.
Some of the companies that the PPTA represents, Martin, have bought up many of the privately run plasma clinics in Europe. So they have their own direct supplies of plasma. How much does plasma cost as a raw ingredient for the medicines that they make? How much does it cost from the European public bodies? How much does it compare to getting it privately? How much does it compare to getting it from the US? I'm trying to understand which is the most expensive route for industry.
I don't have information on exact prices, and also for commercial sensitive reasons, I cannot disclose that. But I can tell you there are different ways of how plasma is being collected and eventually also manufactured. I mean, not all of our member companies are producing PDMPs. We're also representing the European Plasma Alliance, which is the private sector of plasma collectors. There are more collectors at the moment than there are producers. And they all have, I would say, individual contracts, whether it's actually public sector or whether it's a private sector plasma collection center. They have contracts, and very often, in most countries, they have long-term contracts with companies that would eventually fractionate that plasma. So it's a competitive market, let's say. Where public sector is present, or Peter can probably say more about that. It's then, for example, that single unit, the Red Cross, for example, that is organizing tenders to get their plasma fractionated with a certain amount of product that needs to come back for that country, for example. But you have all different kinds of models on how this works, but that's just an example.
Okay, Peter, can you share with us how it works from the public sector's perspective? How is it sold? Are they making a profit?
No, so they're not. It's a not-for-profit. We represent not-for-profit blood establishments. So I suppose it's we work closely with the companies Martin represents it's the chain, I suppose, to focus on supply. It's all about, as we said at the start, and as Thomas in the lead-in, looking at making sure there's sufficient PDMPs for patients in this case. So, if we look at the successful public models, you're looking at where collection is done on a voluntary, non-remunerated basis. They then look to tender to get what's called total fractionation. So that plasma is used to make PDMPs, which then comes back into patients in that region. And I would totally agree with Jakub that the Czech Republic is interesting because it's as far as I understand it, it doesn't have that tie back in. So the plasma is collected and sold and processed, and buying the PDMPs is a completely separate process. So we would strongly advocate for the model whereby across Europe, to meet the patient's needs, plasma collection, we're all in agreement, we need more plasma. But that is tied to production of PDMPs, which then comes back to the patients in the region. And once Europe is strategically independent from the US, from third country plasma, we're then in a better position to look globally and support people in low and middle income countries to, in terms of their needs. But that's the model that works. That's the model. We've seen it in Denmark, we see it in Belgium, we see it in Spain, we see it in Italy. They're all increasing plasma supply on the basis of getting PDMPs back there. Now, some aren't there yet, but it's developing rapidly.
Mm-hmm. And Jakub, can you compare that with what's happening in the Czech Republic? You've obviously collecting a lot of plasma, but are you getting the same access to those plasma-derived medicines that, for example, the Danes and the Belgians and the Italians are, for example?
No, I have to confirm with what was said. This is absolutely a separate process. So, if you are the country producing such a big amount of plasma, it doesn't make you any better access in a number of cases, for the finalized products. So, and the Czech Republic was, traditionally the country where also the blood donation was something what was foreseen, like something very positive. So it has quite a tradition, and till now, I think the current situation, if I can take it like it is, it's still manageable. But we can also see that, for example, we have all those naive donors. The majority of them goes to donate plasma, and less goes to donate blood. And there is not probably the direct correlation, but if they are going, as the first, to donate plasma, therefore in the future are not so motivated to become also the blood donors. This is the one thing. And as it was mentioned, this doesn't really make us, let's say, some better access to the treatment. And also, if I can see the situation, it's not around Europe, it's not getting better. We see, also the companies, from, those, who are working finally with plasma to make the plasma products. They are also, let's say, focusing to open more plasma collection centers, in the Czech Republic, which doesn't make a sense. I think we are already, at the level which is close to the maximum what could be done. So of course, what we would like to see, from the regulation, that there will be the pledge from the rest of the countries, not just to compensate those 7% of growth, because we see the 7% of growth of the plasma-based products. So we should, every country should, let's say, generate 7% plus a year to become close to self-sufficiency. So. Yeah, this is something, what we definitely needs to change in the future. On the other hand, as I said, we don't see any risk, for the patient now. The frequency is not overcoming, so even when you have such a number of centers to collect the plasma, we don't see the health risk for the patient. It doesn't, really correlate. On the other hand, it's more about the sustainability of current situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Stefan, there's quite a few points there that have been raised. For example, the conditionality potentially of having private collections which are conditional upon potentially needing to make sure there's access in those countries. Similar to the examples we've seen in the public sector with Denmark and Belgium, but also the pledge for countries to compensate countries that are collecting far more than the rest of Europe. to what extent are any of these things touched on or tackled in the legislation that's been put forward by the Commission?
Yeah, thanks for asking, because I think I need to manage expectations a little bit here. Because the legislation or the new regulation we're putting on the table, the role and the mandate is really to ensure safety and quality. So that is what you can expect, and there are quite some elements in there that will facilitate plasma collection, in particular making sure there's much more clarity on how VUD is implemented, but also there's many measures in there to protect the donors better, something we don't have in place today, and I think it's a prerequisite if we want to have more collection and we expect more donations, that the donors know that they will be at best protected through the legal framework. What you cannot expect is really organization of plasma collection and elements. So that falls really out of that scope. We see, however, and we follow the discussions also in the member states, so we try to support member states then from our Commission role, more from a policy perspective, not from a legal perspective, and we have some actions that we can that we are funding and we have funded already to help member states to get that knowledge on how to organize and how to manage this chain from supply to patient. And just to complicate it a little bit, there's also, of course, a second legal framework important here, which is the pharma framework. The framework on safety and quality that is currently on the table is only about the first steps towards the donors and the collection. Then once it goes into manufacturing processes and further marketed, that really falls under the pharma framework. But again, the EU mandate there is about safety and quality, not about necessarily negotiating the prices and the contracts. But again, there's work also by the pharma colleagues, also with involvement of the European Medicines Agency to try to get good practices on the table and build the knowledge of the member states.
Okay. Peter, I wanted to ask you a bit more about these programs which are successful in Denmark and Belgium in really making sure that the plasma that's collected there is returned and used by the patients. We've obviously got lots of different types of products that come out of the plasma donations. One of them simply is plasma, and that would be delivered to a patient on a drip, I suppose, in a hospital. What does this include? All the products that are derived from plasma, or is it certain ones, which other ones we have less control over? Because, as we've heard from Stefan, the pharmaceutical industry will need to really develop those.
Yeah, well, they'll like essentially the tender process would, so for plasma that's like directly transfused. That's generally from recovered plasma, so which is taken out of. So in terms of kind of when you see figures, so it's a significant component. Now again, the use is kind of being replaced. It's being replaced by the use of other optional products, but that tends to come recovered. In terms of the tender process, so generally, different countries will have, and even globally and particularly and in Europe. So the need, of course, immunoglobulin is the key driver at the moment. But even during the pandemic, we saw like a shift from intravenous immunoglobulin, which is generally given in a clinical hospital setting, to subcutaneous immunoglobulin, and so the needs for that, because that could be administered, by patients themselves in a lot of cases. So those kind of, but the tenders, of course, take time, and there's different models available, but they will look at what the clinical need is in those countries, in their countries. Again, work with the fractionators of plasma, but the key, that idea of making sure that the patients get what's needed, and that the public, voluntary, non-remunerated donations drive that system, that cycle. That's the key model. So that's what's being kind of implemented across all countries.
Better understood. And Martin, is there any mechanism like this among the private collections centres? And is there perhaps a need, if we're seeing countries like the Czech Republic having such strong private collections and providing much of Europe with the supplies, but really not getting that same access to the treatments? How do we need to solve that problem?
Well, I think they do get an equal access to treatments. I mean, plasma collection is not one-to-one comparable to ensuring patient access to treatment. For example, Czech Republic, but also other countries, it's very much related to price and reimbursement policies, reimbursement of products, how a patient eventually can get access to treatment. to what Peter was saying, so indeed the public sector is mainly collecting plasma through recovered plasma because they have to collect blood for the country, and from that recovered plasma, eventually that's what they sell to companies to fractionate plasma, and that can come back as final product. In Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, Austria, that's where private sector is coexisting with the public sector. So also public sector there is collecting plasma or is recovering plasma from whole blood donations, and that's actually the most efficient system because they collect eventually more plasma than what is needed for the patients. If you compare it with the use of immunoglobulins, and they actually collect for the entire Europe that plasma. Belgium and Denmark, the example you gave, are only for 50% self-sufficient, or still for 50% reliant on products and immunoglobulins coming from one of our members, for example. So, also, I think we need to also take into account that, and Thomas mentioned it in his opening speech, there is a growing clinical need for immunoglobulins. According to the Commission's report, it's somewhere between 6 and 8% that it has been growing over the past 10 years. Thomas mentioned as well secondary immune deficiencies, which is an indication that is growing as well, which is leading from the newest cancer treatment, patients that get an immunodeficiency disease, and also a need of immunoglobulins. So that growth will continue, and I think plasma collection, or the ambition of the public sector for increasing plasma collection, is about 5%. But if the growth of your immunoglobulins is 6 to 8%, you're not going to get there. So therefore, I think there's a real need to collaborate with private sector in order to ensure that we can increase plasma collection in Europe.
Yes.
Just to say the ambition is now 5%. So the ambition is to meet patient needs, to collect sufficient plasma in public blood establishments, meet patient needs. So targets are often set, so here in Belgium, for example, they're set by the national government. But at the last setting, it was 5%. And there's also the point around that, like the growth of 6 to 8% in Europe, but globally the rise is actually higher in demand. So again, if we go back to the Czechs as an example, if you were dependent on market forces and buying in the PDMP, if the demand outside Europe, like theoretically at the moment, Europe could triple its supply of plasma. And if someone is willing to pay more for those products that are fractionated outside Europe, then European patients will still not have the PDMP. So the model, the model must involve the entire chain, not just collection, fractionation, and then delivery back of the PDMPs. It's critical, and we're happy to work with Martin and his companies in delivering that model.
Mm-hmm. Stefan, from the plasma that Europe imports from the US, is it all usable, and is any of it wasted? We know that in the US they do pay a lot higher or compensate people a lot higher for donating their plasma. I'm just wondering to what extent there's wastage in that system.
I'm not following that myself. We have colleagues in the European Medicines Agency who follow that. There's an established process that really makes sure that the collection centers in the US are regularly inspected, that it is quite well recorded where the plasma is coming from, that there are regular looks into the safety of that. So I know about that process, and we really try to make that process as compatible and fluently linking to the SOHO processes, so that we really make sure all the plasma can come as easily as possible. That being said, if there's then still wastage in the system or not, I cannot answer that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask a slightly philosophical question, which is really sort of around this debate of European plasma and paying for it. And I wanted to ask if it's a uniquely European problem, the divisiveness of it. Is it the idea that plasma donation is for the greater good, and the idea of it being European solidarity? Peter?
Good question. So I suppose there's not many countries that allow payments. So if you take the US, it has allowed payments for a long time, but has been divisive. And in terms of, again, looking at the wider system, in terms of whole blood collections and need to meet demands, I suppose it's there's I'm not 100% sure outside Europe what the You know, there are multiple different systems. I think it's divisive everywhere, I'd imagine.
Martin, do you think this is a uniquely European discussion we're having today?
No, absolutely not. I mean, access to plasma-derived medicines is a global issue. I think looking at Europe, the more plasma we can collect on Europe and the less dependent we are from the United States, the more of that US plasma can be used as well elsewhere in the world for patients across the world. There are also several initiatives taking place, for example, in lower middle income countries, to establish or to educate people to increase plasma collection there and to also get that plasma fractionated, as, for example, initiatives by the WHO, but also, for example, by UNITAR, so a subsection of the UN. To give an example where an educational program around plasma collection is in development, let's say. Also, one of our member companies has recently made an agreement with Egyptian government to set up plasma fractionation and plasma collection in Egypt to ensure supply of plasma-derived medicines for Egyptian patients. And there are many more initiatives that are coming up.
Okay, and Stefan, same question to you. Are we enthralled in European solidarity in this discussion?
Well, I think if you look at just access, at the end of the chain, it's indeed, I think it's a global issue. If you look at the beginning of the chain, the donation, I think we are quite unique in Europe. We, as said, we have enshrined in our charter that there's a principle of non-commercialization, and this is principle of solidarity. We do not always, in cross-continental dialogues, see that mirrored. I think we also do have a very broad, responsible donor basis across Europe, not only for plasma, but also for other transplant therapies that can be relied on. And what is, I think, also very strong in Europe is the healthcare systems we have. If you compare them to other continents, we have very well-developed and well-funded healthcare systems that have the possibilities in there to have blood and transplant services in the public setting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And finally, Jakob, same question to you. Is this a European discussion around payment for plasma we're having?
Maybe talking about the solidarity, but we can see that, that really working systems are working with the compensation. They are working, with the private sector, and those systems generates the majority of the plasma which is needed, for the patient here in Europe. On the other hand, and don't take me wrong, I'm proud that we are able to generate, such an amount of plasma and that it's working. But, what is solidarity, from some of the other countries, which says, that the compensation is not the model, which could be accepted, but then using the plasma, which is generated in other country where the compensation works. Yeah. So if we are talking about the solidarity, it needs to work, both ways. We have to set up the system, which is, let's say, similar in Europe. Of course, it doesn't have to be same, but to really have a solidarity system, for this, in this case, we have to have the countries, to be really, using the models which works. And on the other side, if they really say that they don't, it's unethical to compensate the donation of the plasma, then how they can use the plasma from the US, which is where we are not talking about a compensation but a real payment, or the plasma, from the Czech Republic or Germany, where it is compensated. So let's talk really, how to make the system really solidar, not just from one side but also from the other side. As I said, it's still working, and I'm proud of it. But if we want to achieve, the solidarity, then it needs to change in number of states.
And that goes beyond what the substances of human origin regulation has sought to do, but really trying to shore up the resiliency of supplies in Europe. Peter, do you think that the SOHO proposals as they are stand currently from the Commission will succeed in doing that?
Yes, I do. So, in terms of building resilience, and I fully accept what Jakob said, but I suppose, we're looking at models in general. So in terms of resilient supply, let's look at, the risk associated with the remunerated systems. So for example, the US during COVID, 19% drop in plasma supply, which obviously impacted globally. Similarly, remunerated systems in Europe, very significant drops. In the voluntary, non-remunerated, where it's purely driven by altruism, the systems, in fact, some of our members actually increased their plasma supply during COVID. So in terms of building those systems, it's, I suppose I can understand where maybe the negativity around, because it hasn't happened previously, but over the last number of years, there's been real growth in public models, as I said. Denmark, Italy, they're starting from a relatively low base for historical reasons, where basically US plasma flooded the market and took away self-sufficiency, but very much rising. So yes, I do believe that it'll drive forward. There's 90 million citizens in Europe who don't have access to any plasmapheresis program at all, public or private. So, it's looking to implement systems in these countries, build and improve systems in the countries where they exist already.
I looked in the UK at how to donate, and there were only 3 centres in the UK I could go to, and none of them were anywhere near where I live. So.
And they only opened 3 years ago. So, this is, and for historical reasons, as was mentioned earlier, they had, CJD risk, etc. But that's exactly, it's to build up these models.
Mm-hmm. And Martin, same question to you. Do you think the Commission's Soho proposals would ensure up resiliency of supplies in Europe?
Yeah, it's just what Jakob was saying. There are different models in different countries, and I think that the Soho regulation needs to provide a framework, but also needs to be flexible for a country eventually to choose what the most efficient model is in terms of plasma collection. Czech Republic is such an example of an efficient model, so look at Czech Republic, I would say, as a model for other countries. About resilience of supply of plasma, yes, COVID happened, and due to social distancing measures that were put in place, donors had difficulties going to donate blood and plasma. But it's both in the public and in the private sector that donations or plasma collection fell in Europe around 9%. And in all fairness, yes, public sector was mainly because of a decline in blood donations, because you collect volumes of blood according to what you need. If you're going to postpone surgeries, you don't need the blood, so you're not going to collect it, so you're not going to recover plasma from that blood. But there was an equal impact in both public and private sector.
Mm. Stefan, do you agree with what Martin said, that Czech Republic is a model example for balancing these things out?
It is a model of how good private collection can be organized. I think if you look at Europe, it's about 50-50 of what's collected in Europe is by private actors and by public actors. And it's not, to start with, it's not at all on the Commission to decide whether a country should go public, private, or mixed models. That's really national decisions. We really do not feel like we should step into that. But what we do see also, I think we see very high level of efficiency in those private models. What we do see is an increasing efficiency, I would say, in the public sector, also linked to a shift from traditionally more focused on blood collection for transfusion needs to red blood cells, to now also more plasma collection. And it's that shift that I think that looks very promising to see how much plasma we can get out of that. Because in the end, we're going to need all actors here to make sure that we can increase and we can get sufficient plasma for the citizens.
Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for this afternoon. Thank you very much to our panellists for joining us so late in the day. I think it's clear from our discussion that the question over finding the right balance is still in securing sustainable plasma supplies without creating financial motives for donors continues to divide people a little bit here. And this might come potentially down to the fact that we're European, but other concerns around potentially risks with private donation that you've raised in different scenarios. But there are hopes that the Soho regulation will definitely push up those supplies and collections once it's completed. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for today. That's our final panel. I'd like to invite to the stage Joanna for some final remarks. Thank you. Thank you.
That's it. Day one of the Health Summit's coming to a close. It's been a long and intense day of debate, so I won't keep you much longer. I think it's clear that we've got a busy 6 months ahead of us. And yeah, we've got a lot more tomorrow to come. I'd like to thank all the speakers from today for their contribution. And I'd like to thank our partners, again, for making this summit possible. Our leading partners, AstraZeneca, FPA, Emergent, Pfizer, and PPTA. Our presenting partners, Intuitive, Janssen, Novavax, and STADA. And our visibility partner, the European Federation of Nurses. So we've got a full day tomorrow from 9:30. We'll be looking at some of the upcoming health challenges and the future of EU health policy, including interviews with the Belgian Health Minister, a group of MEPs, and the EU's Commissioner for Health. So I hope to see you there, here. And for those of you here with us in person, please do join us for a cocktail in the main networking room. Thank you and have a good evening.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.